something a little bit different. What happens if I am using my property, my field for whatever? I'm producing some unpleasant odor, or as you'll see later, I'm creating some disturbance that is eventually going to reach your field. So, for example, the case we'll talk about is I'm winnowing. In the ancient world, the way they would divide the kernel from the rest of the wheat, from the chaff, they would thresh it, and then they would throw it up in the air, and the wind would blow the chaff away, and the kernels were heavier, they would fall down. So that's what people did always. That's how they separated the kernels from the chaff. So now the question becomes, I'm sitting in my field, and I'm doing the work, which is what people do in their field. I am winnowing, which is the word for throwing up the kernels and the chaff, and the chaff gets blown away. And you're trying to sit and take a suntan in your property because it's a beautiful 70-degree day. And if you sit in the shade, it's cold. If you sit in the sun, it's hot. So you're sitting in the sun, and all of a sudden you get in the shower from the wind is blowing in these shafts from the other field. So you run to your neighbor and you say, stop, move away so the wind shouldn't come. So your neighbor says, sorry, you move away. You have a big field. Move your beach chair a little farther away. In other words, who has to move? Is it the person who causes the damage has to move? It's not physical damage. I'm not harming you. I'm not lowering the value of your property, but it is a nuisance. So the question now becomes, who has to move? Is it the person causing the damage or the person being damaged? And the answer, of course, is it depends. So that's, of course, the answer. There's the reason why I want to look at the Talmud is because there's a Mishnah, and then there's a few stories, and there's give and take. So this could be fun. Hopefully, we can keep track of everything that's going on, all the moving pieces, and then we could then come to Maimonides and codify it and get it down into how he condenses it into a few words. Another example. Okay, so let's learn the Mishnah. Why not? We'll jump right in. I'm gonna try to do as much as I can today. Try to move as quick as possible because it's not too difficult and it's a little fun. Okay, so let's see what's going on. Let me share the screen. This is a piece of Talmud, Bava Batra, which is the third gate, which is where all these laws of shchenim, of neighbors, are taken from. Okay, so the problem that we're discussing over here is a little bit different than what I mentioned. A little bit different than I mentioned. I'll take it off the screen just so I can see you for a minute for the introduction. So the problem over here is as follows. You have a beautiful tree in your yard. In your courtyard, in your field. Beautiful tree, it's got big roots, it's been alive for hundreds of years. I'm trying to dig a hole, a well, a pit in my field. So I dig a well in my field. The problem is that if I dig a hole in my field, I'm also going to destroy the roots that are of your tree, because your tree is next to your border. So now the question becomes, am I allowed to dig a hole in my property? It's my property. Could I dig a hole in my property if I'm going to harm the roots of your tree that are coming into my property? Could you stop me from using my property? That's the question. And the answer is the disagreement in the Mishnah between what they call the first Tana, the first teacher of the Mishnah, in other words, the anonymous person, that's usually the majority, and a rabbi named Rabbi Yossi. And the first person says, well, you have to move away. You have to be 25 amma, 25 cubits. That's almost 50 feet away from a tree. I know it's your property. I know you bought it, but you can't dig a hole in the ground and destroy the roots of your neighbor's tree. That's the first opinion. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you have the right to plant a tree in your field. I have the right to dig a hole in my field, and wherever the chips fall, that's where they fall. In other words, you can't stop me from digging a hole in my field. You don't want the trees to be here? Move your tree away. You're going to plant a tree. Move a tree away from the border. These are the two opinions of the Mishnah. What's going to happen later is the Talmud is going to modify what Rabbi Yossi says, limit what Rabbi Yossi says. Rabbi Yossi says a blanket statement. I can do whatever I want in my field. I don't care about the effect of your field. we're going to limit that to only certain scenarios. So that's how the what they call the sugya, the Talmudic discussion, that's how it's going to develop. Okay, makes sense? Any questions, please jump in. We're sharing the screen. We're going to the Talmud. Says the Mishnah, one must distance a tree 25 cubits from a cistern. And in the case of a carob and of a sycamore tree, whose roots extend farther, one must distance a tree 50 cubits. This is the halacha, whether the cistern or tree is located above or on the side of the other. If the digging of the cistern preceded the tree, the owner of the tree cuts down the trees and the owner of the cistern pays him money. And if the tree preceded the cistern, the owner of the tree need not cut down the tree. If it is uncertain whether this came first or whether that came first, the owner of the tree need not cut down the tree. Rabbi Yossi says, even if the cistern preceded the tree, the owner of the tree need not cut down the tree. This is due to the fact that this one digs in his own property and this one plants in his own property. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated than I said. In the Mishnah, there's a discussion. Could you plant a tree next to my cistern? So I have a cistern, a hole for water. That's why I gather my water. You're planting a tree. The problem is your tree is going to send roots into my cistern, into my water, and ruin the water. So are you allowed to plant a tree too close to my cistern? So it works both ways. I can't put my cistern too close to your tree. You can't put your tree too close to my cistern, even though it's in your property. So the Mishnah, in the first opinion, lays out this system of 25 cubits, 50 cubits. It depends who comes first. If the tree is first, then the tree has more rights. If the cistern is first, then the cistern has more rights. And finally, Rabbi Yossi says, no matter who preceded who, this one digs in his own property and that one plants in his own property. Rabbi Yossi says, leave me alone. Everybody could do whatever they want on their property, and the effect on the other person's property is not that important. So I don't want to get into the cistern case. I want to get into the drama that follows, but if anybody has any questions so far, please share. Otherwise, we go to the Talmud, and the Talmud rules according to Rabbi Yossi, which says everybody can do whatever they want in their field, regardless of the negative effect on your neighbor. However, the moment the Talmud rules according to Rabbi Yossi, the Talmud also limits Rabbi Yossi and says that Rabbi Yossi would concede about a certain class of cases. And then we have a few stories promoting explaining those cases. So if you hang on a little bit more, we'll get to story time, which is always fun. Okay. So the first thing the Talmud does is quote Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, even if the cistern preceded the tree, the owner of the tree need not cut down the tree. This is due to the fact that this one digs in his own property and that one plants in his own property. So that sounds, Rabbi Yossi says, I dig a cistern in my property. You could plant a tree in your property. If my cistern undermines my digging undermines your roots and your tree, that's your problem. If your roots go into my cistern, it's my problem. Nobody can everyone could do whatever they want in their field, and the negative impact on the neighbor is irrelevant. That's what Rabbi Yossi says. So the Talmud now is going to rule according to Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is right. Rabbi Yehuda says that Shmuel said the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. So that sounds like it's almost like everyone could do whatever they want. Now, however, there's a very important caveat. There's a very important qualification, and that comes from Rav Ashi. Now, Rav Ashi, it's very interesting if you know the history of the generations of the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud. Shmuel was the first generation. Rav Ashi was 6 generations later, the last generation. Rav Ashi was one of the two people who were in charge of editing the Talmud at the final generation of the Amoraim. So it sounds like here it's all the same page, but Rav Shmuel lived 6 generations earlier and said the ruling is according to Rabbi Yossi. Generations later, Rav Ashi qualifies it. Says Rav Ashi, when we were studying in the study hall of Rav Kana, we would say that Rabbi Yossi concedes with regard to one's arrows. What does that mean? I.e., one must distance his activities from his neighbor if his actions will cause immediate damage to his neighbor, even if he is acting on his own property. In other words, what Rav Ashi is saying, quoting Rav Kana, what he says, what we learned when we were in the study in Yeshiva of Rav Kana is like this. What Rabbi Yossi says is like this. In the case of I dig my cistern, I'm going to pull out one of your roots, and eventually in 10 years, your tree is going to dry up and die. That's okay. I'm doing it in my property. If I'm doing something in my property which has a direct damage on you, says Rav Kana, Rav Yossi would not agree. Rav Yossi would not agree that you can do it. And what's the example? The example is if I'm standing in my property and I'm shooting arrows into your property. What am I going to say? I'm going to say I'm allowed to because I'm doing it in my property? Of course not. A direct damage flowing from my property to your property that has an immediate impact, says the Talmud, even Rabbi Yossi says you cannot do. Rabbi Yossi is talking about you could do any activity in your property that is going to damage your neighbor eventually, but it's not immediate. So you see so far what we did. We have a dispute in the Talmud. The Talmud basically, the Mishnah seems to say that, the first opinion seems to say that the person being damaged has to distance himself. I'm sorry, the person doing the damage has to distance himself, and therefore there's all kinds of rules. If I'm here first and you want to come and you want to cause damage, I could force you to move away, because the damager has the obligation not to do any damage. Rabbi Yossi says no. Rabbi Yossi says everyone could do whatever they want on their property, and the damage that it causes the neighbor it's not my problem. It's not the damager's problem. The person being damaged has to move away. That's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. What does the Talmud do? How do you rule? Well, we say Rabbi Yossi is right. Basically, you can do anything in your property if it's going to have a negative effect on the neighbor in the distant future. But if it's immediate, he says, no, that you can't do, because that's like sitting and throwing arrows at your neighbor, which is prohibited. And now we get to story time. But in the meantime, if anybody has any questions or comments, please share. It's an interesting question. Question is, who has to move, the person damaging or the person being damaged? And we have these two opinions. We rule according to Rabbi Yossi. We want to expand the person's ability to use his own property. But what we are doing is we're making a qualification that if it's throwing arrows, meaning you'll see it's direct result, I'm doing something and immediately my neighbor is being impacted, even there we would say, oh, no, Rabbi Yossi there doesn't say you could do whatever you want, because that's like shooting arrows. And we'll see, bring the example I mentioned all the way in the beginning about winnowing is such an example. Well, we'll see the story.
Well, I just want to make a quick comment that it's comforting to know that 6 generations after the first discussion, the people discussing it will put some limitations.
Yes.
So apparently the existence of this discussion, it benefits people learning to be considerate. So I think that's the main benefit of Talmud study in general in that particular law, because even if they don't consider the existence of this law will maybe cause them to see, oh, maybe I'm too close, maybe like right away. So it at least puts some limits on it. I think it's very nice.
Yeah, it does. And also what's interesting is to see that you're saying we're limiting, future generations are limiting the scope of the discussion. But if you notice, what are they doing? They're not saying, we can't argue with Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is a sage of the Mishnah. But we're saying Rabbi Yossi would never be discussing that case, right? And say Rabbi Yossi himself would concede that if you're shooting arrows at your friend could stop you. Can't say, I'm shooting arrows in my own property. No, it doesn't work that way. So what we do is, it's very clever. We're modifying the law, but not saying we have the authority. We're saying Rabbi Yossi didn't discuss that. Rabbi Yossi is not talking about that extreme case. So that's the way you do business in the Talmud. You're not going to disagree. You can't disagree with Rabbi Yossi, and you can't disagree with the ruling according to Rabbi Yossi, because it was already established by Shmuel, the greatest Talmudic sage of his generation, right? And Rav and Shmuel were the two great sages of the first generation of the Amoraim, the sages who interpreted the Mishnah. And they were the first generation of the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud interpreting the Mishnah. They were colleagues, and they basically argued about everything, the way it works, Rav and Shmuel. And who does that law follow? So what is actually very interesting, I think this goes out of the ordinary. Yeah, so in general, I'm just realizing, halacha karav, what is it? Let me just check so I don't make a mistake. Oh, I'm sorry, I was right. When it comes to religious law, Is something kosher, not kosher? Is something pure, not pure? The law follows Rav. When it comes to monetary law, the law follows Shmuel. Right? So Shmuel is a big authority on monetary law. So when Shmuel says the law is like Rabbi Yossi, the law is like Rabbi Yossi. Right? But now, however, 6 generations later, Rav Ashi says, well, I'll tell you what happened when we studied this in the yeshiva of Rav Kahana. When we studied it, we're not arguing with Shmuel, God forbid, he's the expert on monetary law. But what we said is Rabbi Yossi is not talking about a case of I'm shooting arrows. If you're shooting arrows at your fellow, of course you can't, even if it's in your property. Okay, so that's a good point. How later generations could influence even settled law. Even settled law could be influenced by the application and defining what scenarios that law covers. Good point. Okay, no more questions. We go to continue the Talmud. We have a story here. Let's go to the story. The Gemara relates a man called Papai, not Papai the sailor, but Papai Yonas, that was his name, was poor and became wealthy. That's where all the bad stories start. No, I'm kidding. He was poor, he becomes wealthy. He built a mansion, which is called in Aramaic an apanda, on his land. So he builds a mansion. Why not? There were these sesame seed pressers in his neighborhood who would work. And when they would press the sesame seeds, their activities would shake his mansion. And that's a problem because I'm sitting in my mansion. And finally becomes wealthy. Doesn't have to go to work. He doesn't have to press the sesames, which was a good business back then. Sesame was a expensive commodity. So he's sitting in his house, and all of a sudden the whole house is vibrating because the neighboring lands, the neighboring properties, the people are pressing sesame, which apparently shakes the land. He came obviously he didn't have a good contractor if his house is shaking because someone's pressing. No, but you have it today. Imagine someone's doing work and there's vibration and it disturbs your sleep. So it disturbs your peace of mind. So he came before Rav Ashi to complain. Remember, Rav Ashi is the same guy who modified Rabbi Yossi's opinion, right? Same guy we mentioned before. He came before Rav Ashi to complain. Rav Ashi said to him, when we were studying in the study of Rav Kahana, we would say that Rabbi Yossi concedes with regard to one's arrows. Here too, because the sesame seed presser causes immediate damage, they must distance themselves. That's beautiful. That's brilliant. Before Rav Ashi, if you learn Rabbi Yossi would just say, look, everyone can do whatever they want. You want to build a palace in your property? Enjoy the palace. You want to press sesame seeds and shake the ground? You could do that too. The fact that the palace is shaking is not your problem. But Rabbi Yossi, but he came before Rav Ashi. He was lucky enough to live in the town of Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, no. This is a different scenario. This is a scenario where the neighbors are pressing the sesame. The ground is shaking. There's immediate damage. That's arrows. Arrows. No, you can't do it. You have to move away. How much do you have to move away? How much vibration can be tolerated? So that you're not going to be so happy because he tolerates a certain level. He only does, in other words, you have to move away in other words, he tolerates a little bit of vibration. This is actually funny. The Gemara asks, and how much must the mansion shake for the owner to have the right to compel the sesame seed pressure to distance themselves? The Talmud answers, it must shake enough that the lid position at the mouth of a jug shakes if it is placed on the wall. Yeah. So all of a sudden your jug's on the wall, the lid on the jug is shaking because the house is shaking. That cannot be tolerated. Okay, so that's one story. Now we get more complicated. So you know what? Before we get complicated, let's just study it in Maimonides, and then we'll come back to the more complicated law if we have a chance. Okay, so I'm going to jump. So remember, the Talmud is more complicated. We had the Mishnah. We had the two opinions of the Mishnah. We then had Rabbi Yossi. We had Rabbi Ashi saying the law follows Rabbi Yossi. We had Shmuel saying the law follows Rabbi Yossi, that basically everyone could do whatever they want on their property, provided everyone could do whatever they want on their property, even if it causes damage to the neighbor. And then we had Rav Ashi saying in the schoolhouse of Rav Kahana, the yeshiva of Rav Kahana, we limited Rav Yossi, and we said Rav Yossi is not talking about an opinion of actual arrows, which means direct damage. So in other words, we had a Mishnah dispute. We had a Talmud ruling like the second opinion in the Mishnah, giving allowance to do whatever you want in your field. And then we had the next future generations limiting that and excluding a case where there's arrows, where there's direct damage. So all of that is going to be condensed in Maimonides into 1 or 2 paragraphs, and you're not going to get the whole give and take. So in some sense, Maimonides is codifier, it's quick, it's to the point, easy to remember. Talmud is more complicated, but that is what we're going to have here. Actually, you know what? We have to learn the next piece also before we can get to Maimonides, because you'll see how there's more complication, how everything is condensed into 2 paragraphs. Okay, now we get to a new problem. I cannot throw arrows at you, which means I cannot press on the earth and shake the earth, and it's going to cause your palace to shake, because that's like shooting arrows, direct damage. Now the question becomes, what happens if it's not me alone? It's me together with something else. For example, me together with the wind. I'm not damaging you, the wind is damaging you. You don't like the wind, call the weatherman, right? So that's the question. And the example is the example I mentioned right away in the beginning. You have the case of winnowing in the ancient world. As I said, the way they would prepare the kernels of grain is first you would cut the wheat, then you would thresh, you would step on it to separate the kernel from the chaff. The kernel is the part you want, the chaff is the garbage. The problem is, how do I now separate the kernels from the chaff? So what they would do is they had a big shovel and they would throw everything up in the air, and the kernels were heavier, the kernels would fall down, and the wind would blow the chaff away right into the neighbor's property. So now the question is, am I allowed to do that? So that neighbor is going to say, stop shooting arrows. I say, no, I'm throwing it up, and the wind is blowing it. It's not just me, it's the wind. So now the question becomes, could you stop me from doing something which you claim is damaging you like arrows, if I could say, it's not really me, it's me with the wind. You don't have it, you don't like it, go speak to the wind. So that's going to be the next situation, and we'll figure out, we'll see what the Talmud does. And all this is going to be combined, like I said, into 2 paragraphs in Maimonides, which is nice to see the way he does what he's supposed to do, which is condense. Okay, here we go. This is the story. The Gemara relates, when the members of the household of Bar Marion, son of Ravin, this is his household, when they would beat their flax, the chaff would fly off and harm people. The chaff flew to the neighbors. Those people came before Ravina to complain. Ravina said to them, when we say that Rabbi Yossi concedes with regard to arrows, this statement applies only when the damaged item moves by his direct force. Here, by contrast, it is the wind that carries the chaff. So you're going to see here in a minute that there's a dispute, and Maimonides does not take this opinion. But there's a dispute. What's the dispute? This guy, this great rabbi, Ravina, who happens to be Rav Ashi's colleague, who we just discussed the 6 generations later, Ravina and Rav Ashi were the 2 people who concluded the Talmud. Ravina says no. Ravina says this house of the household of Bar Marion could continue beating their flax, and the chaff could fly into the neighboring property. Why? I know Rav Yossi, I know they told us that law became that Rav Yossi does not allow you to do something in your property that's going to damage your fellow if it's like the arrow going directly. But here, it's not your arrow. It's the arrow, it's your action together with the wind. That's Ravina's opinion. We're not going to stand by this opinion. We're going to attack this opinion. But that's Ravina's opinion. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I just wanted to comment that it didn't say in the argument that the Rebbe Yossi didn't say about the errors. It's only the people who interpreted said it about the errors. Even with the case with the errors, the wind can blow and bring the error somewhere, right? And if you only extract the meaning of it, which is immediate damage, is it doesn't matter who did the damage, because you triggered something in natural forces.
Okay, so that's going to be the next opinion of the Talmud. That's Marbar Rav Ashi's opinion. That's the next opinion, Rav Ashi's son. But Rav Ashi's colleague Ravina, if I have to defend Ravina, because that's my job in the Talmud, you have to really understand what each person is saying. He would say, look, let's look at the case of the actual arrows that we discussed before, the vibration. The vibration happens regardless if it's a windy day or not. See what I'm saying? So there's a difference. Ravina says there's a difference between something that I do and it's only could be attributed to my own action exclusively, which is the vibration. And then this, you can't, Ravina says, look, the case is a little bit different. Where yes, there's my action, I'm beating my flax, but I'm not causing it directly to go into your property. It's also the weather. So I'm not saying, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying there's a distinction. Whether or not that distinction is strong enough to allow me to beat the flax is a disagreement between Ravina and Rav Ashi's son. And we're going to rule like you. We're going to rule like Rav Ashi's son. You cannot do it. The fact that the wind helps is of no consequence. But what's fascinating is the proof. What's the proof? And this is very interesting because here you will see what I always say, that all parts of Torah are intertwined. Okay, so how are you going to prove whether I'm allowed? This is a law about monetary rights. This is a law about, am I allowed to use my property to bang my to thresh my flax and have the shaft go into your property? It's monetary law. However, the way we're going to figure out what the law is, we're going to bring an example from the laws of Shabbat. What's the laws of Shabbat? Beautiful. This is so beautiful. What's the law of Shabbat? Shabbat, winnowing is a prohibition. One of the 39 prohibited labors is I'm not allowed to throw the wheat into the ear, have the ear blow away the flax, the chaff, and have the kernels fall down. Says my Rav Ashi, 1 second. Shabbat, I'm not allowed to do it, which means, why can't I say, I didn't do it, the wind did it? No, it doesn't work that way. Regarding Shabbat, if you do it together with the wind, it's still considered your action. The fact that the wind have helped you is of no consequence. We still attribute it to you, and therefore it's prohibited on Shabbat. And therefore, if it's prohibited on Shabbat, it's prohibited to do to your neighbor. I think this is absolutely profound because what we're doing is it just shows how all parts of the Torah are interrelated. So let's read this quickly. Mar bar Rav Ashi objects to this. Now, if we had a map, a spreadsheet, we can do what we could do. The people here is fascinating because we had Rav Ashi limited Rav Yossi. Rav Ashi's colleague Ravina said, well, if you're doing it with the wind, it's not really arrow. Rav Ashi's son, Mar bar Rav Ashi, attacks his father's colleague, and he says, no, it doesn't work. He's really defending his father. Interesting stuff. And in any case, without getting into the names too much, Mar bar Rav Ashi objects to this. In what is this case different different from one who winnows on Shabbat by throwing the grain into the wind so that the chaff is blown away and wind assists him? That is considered a primary category of labor on Shabbat, despite the fact that the act is performed partly with the aid of the wind. This is very interesting. Now, I'm not going to, I think we'll stop right here because, so they bring this back. The Gemara relates that the sages stated this objection with regard to beating the flax before Mereimar. Mereimar said to them, this case is the same as one who winnows and the wind assists him, just as this is considered his direct force for the purpose of halachot of Shabbat. It is likewise considered his direct force with regard to the halachot of damage. We're going to leave Ravina alone for a minute because I want to get to the Talmud to summarize. We had a few cases here. We had the case of the Mishnah. The first opinion of the Mishnah says, if you have to be careful that what you do in your property shouldn't damage your friend. For example, you should be careful not to dig a hole in the ground too close to your friend's tree. And if you want to, your friend can stop. And if you're trying to dig a hole too close to his tree, your friend can stop you and say, you got to move away because you're digging the hole is going to uproot his roots. The opposite is true too. You can't plant a tree too close to your friend's cistern, your friend's hole of water, because then your tree is going to eventually going to grow into his water cistern. So that was the first opinion. The second opinion says, no, you cannot tell the other person what to do in their property. You can do whatever you want in your property. Your neighbor can do whatever they want in their property. And if there's damage down the road, too bad on the person being damaged. If you don't want your cistern being damaged, don't bring it so close to the border. In other words, the nizak, the person being damaged, has to move away. That is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. So comes the Talmud. The Talmud says we rule like Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel, the first generation of the Amoraim, of the sages who interpret the Mishnah, says we rule like Rabbi Yossi, which basically means you could do whatever you want on your property. If you don't want to be damaged, move away from the person causing the damage. Then we have a few generations later, Rav Ashi says, okay, but we're going to limit Rav Yossi. If you're actually causing damage to your friend, directly, like with shooting arrows, then you can't do that. The friend could stop you. And we had an example, the example of the people beating their, grinding their sesames, which was creating vibration, which was shaking the poor guy's palace, the poor guy who became rich. The guy's palace, he could stop them. Why doesn't Rabbi Yossi say that everyone could do whatever they want on their property? Yeah, but your vibration is like shooting arrows. That's direct, immediate damage. The neighbor could stop you. And then we get to this case of what happens if things that travel, the damage travels not by my action alone, but by the wind as well. By the way, that's what Maimonides' cases, all going to be cases that travel through wind. And there we had a debate, but we proved from the laws of Shabbat that just like Shabbat, you're not allowed to do something, you're not allowed to winnow, even though you're not doing the work alone, the wind is helping you. So too, with regard to the laws of neighbors, if you're causing the shaft to fly into your neighbor's property, based on your action plus the action of the wind, your neighbor could stop you because it's like shooting arrows with the help of the wind. That is the Talmud. We have Ravina, but if I had time, I'll get into that. But I want to skip him for now. He'll forgive me, not because we're gonna get back to him if God gives us long life. Okay, so that's just gonna be two sections. 1, 2, what we just spoke for 35 minutes. Maimonides gives you in 60 seconds. When a person makes a threshing floor within his own property, or establishes a latrine or a place to perform work that creates dust, dirt, or the like. So this is things that have a bad smell, right? So a bathroom or a place that creates dust. So I'm doing work and it's producing dust and the dust is flying. He must distance the place of his activity far enough that the dirt, the odor of the latrine, or the dust does not reach his colleague and cause him damage. Now, you know the history, so you know this is the case of arrows. This is the case of I'm doing it together with the wind. Because when with the smell, how does the smell travel? The smell travels with the wind. How does the dust travel? Dust travels with the wind. And nevertheless, Maimonides rules, according to Mar Bar Avashi and Meremar, he rules that if you're doing something that's like arrows, even if the wind is helping you, you have to remove, the person doing the damage has to move away. Even if it is the wind that brings dirt, the loose strands of flax, or the chaff, or the like, generated when he performs his activity to his colleague's premises. So in other words, you say it's not just me, it's the wind as well. Nevertheless, he must separate himself so that it does not reach his colleague's property and cause damage, even when this is the cause by an ordinary wind. For all these situations can be likened to causing damage with one's arrows. And that is how Maimonides really condenses all that discussion of a full page in the Talmud into one paragraph. But something interesting that the Talmud does not say explicitly, and this is what Maimonides adds himself based on the ruling of his teacher, the Rif, which is his teacher's teacher. This is very interesting. Even though, we'll read number 2, even though, that's why you need Maimonides to add this, because this is not in the Talmud. Even though a person is obligated to make such a separation, if an ordinary wind carried the chaff or the dirt and it caused damage, the person performing the activity is not liable to pay. For it is the wind's influence that caused the damage. It did not come about because of the force of the person whose act led to the damage. So what's happening here, Maimonides is taking a middle ground. If I'm going to do something that causes damage from me and the wind together, so like, for example, I throw the chaff in the air and the wind blows it, you could stop me from doing it. That you can do. But if you didn't stop me and it happened to cause damage, it happened to ruin your plant or whatever the case is, then I don't have to pay. Because for me to pay, I have to be fully responsible. And here I'm not fully responsible, I'm only partially responsible. So what Maimonides is doing here is very interesting. He's saying you could stop your neighbor from causing you damage, that you could do. But if you didn't tell the guy to stop, and he damaged you, it's not considered, you don't have to pay. In other words, in the case of the shake, you vibrated the guy's house so strong and the house collapsed, then you would have to pay because there's no wind involved. But if this is something that the damage comes from me and the wind, it's together, there the case would be different. There, you could stop your neighbor from doing it, but if you didn't stop him and you were damaged, the neighbor doesn't have to pay. This creates all different discussions. I'm here, my commentary says many layers of commentary on Maimonides trying to figure out why exactly and why it differs from the case of Shabbat, but that will be for another time. Just to show here the complexity, we have a Mishnah, a debate in the Mishnah, we have a ruling, we have a limitation of that ruling, and then we have Maimonides discussing, expanding the discussion to not only could you stop me or not stop me, but what is the law if you didn't stop me and I damaged, do I have to pay in that case? That is not discussed in the Talmud. That Maimonides gets from his teacher's teacher, the Rif, the author of the Halachos, who was one of the early codifiers as well.
Well, I don't know if we have time for a quick question.
Of course, yeah.
What if the neighbor didn't stop the other neighbor from doing it because he simply didn't see it, and he doesn't have to pay, but other consequences, I mean, the relationships and stuff like that.
So that's very interesting. I think Maimonides would say if you didn't see, you still can't charge. You still, let's say you didn't see the guy is causing the dust, and the dust comes and ruins your plants. You can't charge him according to Maimonides. Why? Because he didn't do it alone. There's many other people trying to explain what Maimonides is saying this. It's a little bit complicated, exactly the reasoning, but the takeaway would be, according to Maimonides, you cannot bill him. You could stop him from here on. You could say you can't do this anymore. You could stop him from here on. That you could do, because again, it's his action together with the wind. You could stop him. You could say you can't do it anymore, and you can enforce that. You can call the police. You can enforce that. But to bill for the damage that it caused your property or your plant, that you can't do. Why not? Because it becomes more complicated. Basically, everyone reads it differently, but in the halacha, there's something called indirect damage. And indirect damage is a complicated scenario, because the halacha doesn't always recognize that you have to pay monetary compensation for indirect damage. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's very complicated to figure that out. But here, it's even more complicated, because it's indirect damage, which also comes through another force, through the wind. So the combination would make it very hard to make someone pay. But what you could do is you could stop the person from here on. That you could do. And there's no mechila, like I said, there's we discussed in the past, if you see the person damaging, and you'll see later in this chapter, actually, usually we say, if your person doesn't have the right to do something and they do it and you're silent, you give up your right to protest. Not in this case. These damages of dust, of earth, of smell, they're considered so offensive that just being silent, even if you saw and you were silent, that itself does not mean you give away the right to protest later, because this is seen as such a terrible damage, and that will be discussed later in this chapter, in chapter 11, in halacha 4. That will be the next discussion. But just a little bit of programming note, I think we're going to take a break from Maimonides for the next 6 weeks, because I think next week we're starting the JLI for 6 weeks of Mashiach. So we'll get back to the laws of Maimonides' neighbors. When could be, we'll go to a new subject in chapter 12, which starts a whole new discussion of bar mitzvah, of right of first refusal. If you're going to sell, maybe sell to your neighbors. That's its own discussion. Maybe we'll pick up in chapter 12 in 7 weeks from now in good health. Hopefully in the fresh air and on Zoom. Hopefully, God willing, with good health.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay well. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Okay, wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Dr.